Hi, my name is Marie Romagnano, founder of Healthcare Professionals for Divine Mercy. I'm happy to present to you our educational conferences that integrate medicine, bioethics, and the spirituality of Divine Mercy in patient care for healthcare professionals. Because of their importance, even if you're not a medical professional, we invite you to join us. Today, I wish to offer a summary of a conference presentation given by Dr. Christopher Kloft, entitled Rethinking Sexual Orientation. Dr. Christopher Kloft is an associate professor of theology at Assumption College in Worcester, Massachusetts. Dr. Kloft shared how the term and sexual orientation originated as a linguistic construct in order to delineate and classify people, thus creating a whole new class of people defined solely by their sexual acts. The terms of sexual orientation were originally made to make distinctions of what is normal and what is not normal. Today, though, society has said that every sexual orientation is normal. Because of this, Dr. Kloft suggests that we stop using the language of sexual orientation. As for the development of the terms in the acronym LGBTQIAAP, Dr. Kloft explained how confused current culture has become. Sexual orientation is no longer a matter of sexual attraction, but has become a defining element of modern identity politics. The scientific community has not even agreed on whether or not sexual orientation can even be defined in biological terms. Even if someone claims sexual orientation is genetic and that they are born that way, such a result cannot be demonstrated by science. Orientation remains merely a social fiction that obscures more than it enlightens. Quoting Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger in On the Pastoral Care of Homosexual Persons, Dr. Kloft shared that, "Today, the Church badly needs a context to define a person by what truly matters, a person as a creature and child of God made in His image and likeness." I believe the Church should stop using the language of sexual orientation, which she is already doing, Dr. Kloft shared. Instead, we should see people as people who make sexual choices, not as an ideological class of people who are defined by sexual acts and judged separately from everyone else. To think of people not as though who have a unique burden, but rather as people called to chastity, Dr. Kloft shared, that the ability to understand, the ability to love, these are things that are truly fundamentally human. Our happiness is not dependent on our ability to engage in sexual acts. People who claim to be a part of the LGBT community deserve the truth to be shared with them in charity. I invite you to listen to the complete presentation of Dr. Kloft as he presents in a succinct way a very important topic of today, rethinking sexual orientation.
Good morning, everyone. It's been a great conference, hasn't it? Yes, indeed. All right. I'm just setting myself up here. I will apologize that last night when I went to bed, a frog crawled into my throat and died. So I'm struggling a little bit here, but I'm just going to let the Holy Spirit do the work and power through this. The presentation that I want to offer to you today is for us to have the opportunity to rethink the category of sexual orientation. In the teaching of the Church, there's been an increasing emphasis these days on the use of the term sexual attraction instead of sexual orientation. However, the difference between that, I'll get into what I mean by the difference between these terms. However, the official teaching of the Church, as codified in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and in several important CDF documents and other papal statements, such as the Guidelines for Confessors in the early 70s, Persona Humana in 1975, the Pastoral Considerations of 1986, the additional pastoral considerations of 1991, all of these documents over the past 40 years still explicitly or implicitly are using the language of sexual orientation. And furthermore, this language of orientation, of course, remains dominant in the public discourse of the Western world. So here's my point here. The theological problem with this discrepancy in language is sexual orientation does not exist. The first person that I came across who suggested this approach to me was a young theologian by the name of Michael Hannon. And I have since given, ever since I came across it, I've given it more thought, and it's an inescapable conclusion to me that we are doing ourselves a disservice by continuing to use the term sexual orientation. Rather, sexual orientation is a linguistic construct aimed at the categorization of people. And why would we do this? Well, we do it for ideological purposes. We do it for political purposes. We do it just because it's colloquially convenient to talk about people in this way. But as this construct is accepted as a delineation of the truth about human persons, questions about the morality of homosexual activity become framed in very specific ways. Now, the reasons for the immorality of homosexual sexual activity are clearly enunciated in Scripture and tradition. They are also accessible to us by reason. As we look, just to give you the very brief overview, as we look at the meaning of human sexual activity, we see it from, again, both the perspective of reason and revelation, that not only has God revealed to us that the sexual relationship is one that is intended for a man and a woman for the procreation of children and for the raising of those children to be members of the kingdom of God, but also we can determine by reason alone that the sexual act is ordered towards reproduction. And we could go further than that, but that's the basics here. As a result of the language of orientation, the evaluation of any particular instance is sometimes colored by this false distinction of a person's sexual orientation. Simply put, that it's normal for a person who has a homosexual sexual orientation. As such, I am suggesting that we stop using this term and focus instead on the sexual acts performed by persons apart from any category. This change will contribute to a more accurate sexual ethic that is better understood as equally applicable to all people, and most importantly for our purposes today, this will improve the pastoral ministry of the church, and particularly your work in the field. The first use of the term homosexual actually can only be traced back as recently as the late 18th century, though the specific origin and author of the term seems unclear. Different people may claim to have the first use of the term. The author Michel Foucault, and if you do not know Michel Foucault, then I put him in the same category as Cardi B. You don't need to know him in order to get through your life. But Michel Foucault, in his second volume of The History of Sexuality, describes the rise of the term homosexual as a development of the older term in use, sodomite. Now, sodomite as a term describes a person who engages in a particular kind of activity, sodomy, which is, again, not as easily defined as you might think, but I'll spare you the details on that. The newer term, homosexual, that replaced sodomite, instead describes a classification or identification of a person as a whole, not just activity. By defining the homosexual in contrast to the heterosexual, the result was all heterosexually oriented sexual activities came to be defined as normal. In fact, this was one of the motivations for defining homosexual, while those sexual activities between persons of the same sex were abnormal. We cannot make such a distinction that heterosexual sexual activity is automatically normal, that is to say, moral, and any homosexually sexual activity is abnormal and thus immoral. But beyond this evaluation of sexual acts, the new term defined a whole new class of persons who were entirely defined by their sexual behavior. This new classification became so ingrained as a social construct that it took on the authority of being empirical truth. Some persons are heterosexuals, and some persons were homosexuals. In the past decades, this complication has been amplified as classifications of persons are even further subdivided beyond orientation, as you might recall I was talking about yesterday, and then combined together with these experiences that are best only tangentially related to sexual orientation. So for example, in the case of the alphabet soup that we talked about yesterday, just to remind you again, the LGBTQQIAA, amongst many of those letters of that classification, some of them have nothing to do with sexual activity. Transgenderism has nothing to do explicitly with sexual activity. Intersex phenomena has nothing to do with sexual activity, yet ideologically and conveniently in our culture, they are lumped together in the simple LGB classification. We are now defining people by whether they correspond to a particular vision of sexual activity. The alphabet soup has created a demarcation between people that are, again, for lack of a better term, normal, and those who are not normal, yet the very ideological drive of this movement is to say that all of these things are equally normal, which calls into question why we need this distinction. The classification of orientation is a problem, first and foremost, because it's not true, but even to use the language of orientation as a convenient descriptor requires a clear meaning of the term, which is also absent. In common usage, orientation is used to express a predominant sexual attraction to either the opposite sex or to one's own sex. And at first, this seems to be a simple and effective definition. But it suffers from a lack of precision on several levels. First, what does sexual attraction mean? Does it mean a desire to engage in physical sexual activity with someone? Does mere arousal also constitute attraction? If a person finds themselves sexually drawn to a person but never acts on that, is that attraction? If a person finds another person aesthetically pleasing but with no desire to engage in sexual activity, is that attraction? As a person who is colloquially referred to as a heterosexual male, if I see another man and go, "That's a good-looking man," is that sexual attraction? If a person has a deep, abiding emotional attachment to a person, is that a sexual attraction? The term orientation has been used in all of the ways I've just described in various studies to mean any or all of these things, which greatly inhibits the value of the term as a descriptor, because if you're going to use research information that has been done on homosexual persons, or homosexual persons versus heterosexual persons, you have to know what they mean by this. Famously, let me use an example of a series of authors that I do not recommend should you do research in this area. For the longest time in the United States, the Kinsey Report was held as the most important study of human sexuality that has been done. It is garbage, and I don't recommend you use it. Now, there's some reasons for this. The reasons are primarily because the research methods that were used in the 1930s and 40s to gather this were problematic, to say the least. For one thing, many of the people in the Kinsey surveys were self-selected to talk in detail about their sexual practices. We have to remember contextually, we're talking about the 1930s and 40s, and therefore the people who were willing to openly talk about their sexual practices with strangers were a particular kind of person. Furthermore, Kinsey did a lot of his research on prisoners. who we might say have also slightly different approaches than the mainstream. And then finally, in regards to the subject at hand, his definition of what constituted homosexual is very, very broad. Because Kinsey famously said that most people engage in homosexual activity at some point in their life. Something that I am guessing that most of the people present here today might be surprised to find out. Perhaps you've been missing out on something and didn't even know. Well, what did he actually mean by this? Have you ever hugged your same-sex friend in greeting? If so, according to Kinsey, you have engaged in homosexual activity. Some of you unknowingly have engaged in homosexual activity this morning. Needless to say, this is so broad a category that we have to try to figure out what we're going to do with this if we're going to use it. All right, furthermore, how predominant does one's attraction need to be considered an orientation? How many persons, defined by the opposite of my orientation, do I need to be attracted to in order to call into question my understood orientation? If I say one man is handsome, that might be acceptable, but how many men do I have to say are handsome before I need to call into question my heterosexual orientation? These are important questions. This reality, apparently common in the contemporary world, that is to say that human beings find themselves attracted to men and women, initially gave rise to the use of a third term for orientation, bisexuality. This did not bring about clarity in discussing sexual acts or sexual relationships. We also see this manifested in interesting ways in popular culture. A not as frequent plot line in television and movie drama is the character who discovers themselves to have same-sex attraction. And it used to be something that you could eke a couple of episodes out of drama out of, but now it's so commonplace that nobody even bothers trying anymore. But it was a case where if a character who had previously been attracted to the opposite sex, now found him or herself attracted to the same sex, this was a great discovery. It was a great discovery of finding their true self. Interestingly, what you won't see in our popular culture is a character that predominantly has same-sex attraction then enter into a meaningful sexual relationship of a person of the opposite sex. You know what happens in the plot line then? That person says they're lying to themselves. They're not being true to who they are. Our popular culture has curiously created a circumstance in which the default presumption is that we're all same-sex attracted. It's just a matter of time before we discover it. Strange. Finally, there's a third problem that is a bit beyond this presentation today and also recalls what we were talking about yesterday. Is the term sex even relevant anymore? I offer a situation to you. If a person with male genitalia identifies as a woman, but is sexually attracted to people with male genitalia, are they oriented to the same sex or to the opposite sex? Questions like this have no consistent answers among the multiplicity of the voices who have considered them. Attempts to use the category of orientation have obscured rather than enlightened. And that's not the end of the difficulties. Aside from the historical problems associated with the origin of the term itself and the confusion elicited in the current context, there are three additional challenges that I'd like to outline for us today. A scientific challenge, a philosophical challenge, and a moral challenge. The scientific challenge is made very clear for us with Dr. Stackpole's discussion yesterday. The scientific challenge stems from the inability of the scientific community to actually identify the concept of orientation as a biological dimension of the human person. Over the past 30 years, many studies have been done that have attempted to demonstrate a somatic origin for same-sex attraction to no avail. So, contrary to the wisdom that has been offered to us by Lady Gaga, eventually, I guess we are not born this way. We should pray for Lady Gaga. But I think she has a lot more that she can give to us from her Catholic background than Madonna ever could. So, none of these studies can stand up to scientific rigor. Now, there is some evidence for a biological predisposition towards same-sex attraction, and the most interesting research that has been done on that just in the past 10 years has been based on certain epigenetic markers. I am not a scientist. Some of you know more about what I'm talking about than what I'm saying right now. But the idea is that these are certain genetic switches that in themselves can be activated by environmental factors. However, when you start to look at these studies that have demonstrated that there might be an epigenetic cause to same-sex attraction, you will find great controversy on both sides of the equation, driven largely by politics and ideology. Even in this case, though, these epigenetic markers would not demonstrate a purely somatic basis for same-sex attraction. It would say that there's still environmental and psychological factors that would play into the development of the attraction. As a result, Catholic teaching, which uses the language of sexual orientation, is based on a faulty foundation, when it should be based on the best scientific data available. The 1991 document Dona Veritatis says, finally, a consultation of the human sciences and theology is also necessary to understand better the revealed truth about man and the moral norms for his conduct, setting these in relation to the sound findings of such sciences. We should use sound findings. Second, the philosophical problem with the use of the term sexual orientation is that it creates an arbitrary and superficial anthropological category by which a person is defined. One of the most important documents for the Church on the teaching of same-sex attraction was written by Cardinal Ratzinger in 1986, the CDF document on the pastoral care of homosexual persons. One quote from this is from that document. This is paragraph, page 16, paragraph 3 of this. The human person, made in the image and likeness of God, can hardly be adequately described by a reductionist reference to his or her sexual orientation. Today, the Church provides a badly needed context for the care of the human person when she refuses to consider the person as a heterosexual or a homosexual, and insists that every person has a fundamental identity, the creature of God, and by grace, his child and heir to eternal life. This is an important point. The only category that really matters for identifying a person as a person is that he or she is a creature made in the image and likeness of God. This is a beautiful statement from 1986, but it's unfortunate that the quote still uses the language of orientation. It still classifies people by this same metric. But aren't I making too much of this? Isn't it the case that we use descriptors all the time to categorize people in all sorts of ways for orientation? So we talk about race or ethnicity, we talk about hair color and eye color, we talk about politics, nationality, musical tastes. All of these are terms that we use to categorize people as a shorthand. Couldn't we also use this shorthand to talk about their sexual practices? Well, among the innumerable descriptors that we could use to describe a person, our sexual nature is certainly amongst the most important of them. And this was implied very much in the beginning of the 1975 CDF statement, Persona Humana. But the lack of specificity of what exactly constitutes orientation threatens to reduce our personhood to a matter of preferences and passions, as if we were to evaluate a person based on whether they preferred coffee ice cream or strawberry ice cream, though I would assert that there is an objectively correct answer to that question, rather than honoring the significance of this most important dimension of our being. This leads to the third problem, the moral problem. As noted by Michael Hannon in his presentation of Foucault's history, the use of heterosexual and homosexual orientation as labels led inadvertently to the acceptance of all heterosexual sexual activity as good, or at least as better than homosexual sexual activity. After all, a person might fornicate with a person of the opposite sex, but at least it was sexual activity with the opposite sex rather than the abomination of homosexual sex, as Leviticus states. The classical evaluation of a moral act given to us by Aquinas and codified in the Catechism for us considers an act according to its object, its intention, and its circumstances. So we evaluate the morality of an action by what it is in itself, by why we do the act, and then if there are any other circumstances that would modify our understanding of that act. This is a functional, useful framework, which might be the reason why it has lasted as long as it has. According to this framework, homosexual sexual activity is intrinsically evil as it is immoral in its object. Now, just to explain some of the philosophical terminology there, an act that is intrinsically evil is an act that can never be morally good, regardless of the intention of the act, regardless of the circumstances surrounding the act. And the reason for this is that homosexual sexual activity is immoral in its object, the very act itself. This is what was meant by the CDF in the 1986 statement when it referred to the homosexual orientation as objectively disordered. It was an attraction to an activity that could never be morally good. And to quote from that document, although the particular inclination of the homosexual person is not a sin, it is a more or less strong tendency ordered toward an intrinsic moral evil, and thus the inclination itself must be seen as an objective disorder. A couple of things I want to say about this. First, if you are in a position in which you do ministry to persons with same-sex attraction, I strongly advise you do not begin with objective disorder. While it is philosophically a useful terminology, it is not pastorally sensitive because it is based upon an understanding of the specific meaning of the term, but I can tell you exactly how it's heard. You saying, I'm objectively disordered. Therein lies the difficulty. Now, as we heard yesterday, though, from Dr. Stackpole, we are all disordered. We all possess objective disorders. Homosexual sexual attraction is not a special kind of objective disorder. It's just to point out that it is an attraction towards intrinsically evil acts. Now, we can further complicate this philosophically by noting Aquinas' other distinction, especially in regard to sin. He makes a distinction between sins against chastity that are according to nature and sins against chastity that are against nature. Now, mind you, you might occasionally run into a person who takes issue with Thomas Aquinas, especially on the matter of sexual morality, and this is where it's going to fall apart. Now, I have to clarify this because I want to explain why people think this, and I also want to explain why they're wrong. All right. In defining sins as sins against nature or sins according to nature, he's talking about sins. However, a sin against nature is one that violates the meaning of the sexual act itself, which for Thomas is primarily procreation. A sin according to nature is a sin that does not violate the meaning of the sexual act itself, that is, its order towards procreation, but is still wrong. And there is definitely an implication in Thomas's moral thought that a sin against nature is more grievous than a sin according to nature. Now, if you followed along with all that, you might say, all right, I see where he's going with that, except then we actually have to look at a few examples, and this is where people take issue with Thomas because they don't properly understand him. Homosexual sexual activity is a sin against nature. Fornication is a sin according to nature. Masturbation is a sin against nature. Rape is a sin according to nature. Have you seen the problem? Okay. So without a proper understanding of the whole of Thomistic moral thought, it sounds like, did you say that Thomas says that rape is less severe than masturbation as a sexual sin? No. No, Thomas doesn't say that. Thomas also says that rape is a gross violation against justice, but which masturbation is not. but he is trying to distinguish what is natural, what is according to right order, and that's the reason he makes this distinction. Now, this is not a perfect framework for understanding the complexity of sexual ethics, but it does accurately point out that homosexual sexual activity and contraceptive heterosexual activity are both sins that violate the meaning of the sexual act. This makes sense, as in each case, the morality of the act is grounded in the act itself. But we do not rely solely on a purely act-driven account of morality. We now also have the advantages brought about in the 20th century by personalism and personalist methodologies, of which, again, John Paul II is an excellent example of this. Broadly speaking, personalism incorporates an individual's experiences into moral evaluation, but even in these cases, Orthodox Catholic morality is still grounded in the act itself. Now, the language of orientation presents a circumstance without foundation that has the potential to change the evaluation of an act in an erroneous way. For example, we could say, the person's orientation as homosexual is a circumstance that means that for this person, we would evaluate their sexual activity in a different way. Now, this is not good Catholic moral theology, but it does work when it's filtered through erroneous moral methods, such as proportionalism and consequentialism. We touched a little bit on consequentialism yesterday, and proportionalism is a bastardization of the principle of double effect that sees that the circumstances have a higher weight than the object, potentially than the object itself. All right, thus the language of sexual orientation, which is not grounded in sound empirical evidence, is a social construct that has become unmoored from its original questionable origins, now used for ideological purposes. But it possesses such a strong weight in popular understanding that it makes it seem like it's an established truth about human persons. And this language has been part of the official church teaching for over 40 years. This has led to cultural and theological challenges to the church's teaching, even though the traditional moral teaching of the church readily addressed this difficulty. The church had always properly taught why homosexual sexual activity was wrong, but it got caught up in the language of the times. This is something that we always have to be aware of. Taking into account the complexity of human sexual experiences and the best evidence offered by the social sciences, I believe the church should stop using the language of sexual orientation, which, by the way, it is doing. In its place would be the simple recognition that, if I can again borrow some musical wisdom, Depeche Mode, circa 1984, that people are people and people make sexual choices. Let's stop classifying people as being this kind of person that makes sexual choices versus this other kind of person that makes sexual choices, and let's acknowledge that as human beings, we make sexual choices. The fact that some people make them in relationship to people of the same or the opposite sex, whether exclusively or primarily or just occasionally, does not need to be established as an identity or class of people who are subject to potentially different moral evaluation. Rather, the sexual choices made by people should be evaluated according to the objective standard applicable to all persons. This has been the teaching of the church throughout history, but presently is confused. Several implications can be drawn out from this proposed change in approach to the church's language. Such a change in emphasis, on the one hand, positively strengthens the image of the church as a countercultural voice in society. I said that in the conclusion of my paper yesterday, and I really want to highlight this, that we need to be a countercultural voice in society. And on the other hand, it still demonstrates that the church has given serious thought to the complexity of modern and postmodern perspectives on human sexuality. The church should not be afraid to support social scientists who challenge the prevailing status quo about the inevitability of sexual orientation, though this has become increasingly dangerous. It is now harder and harder for social scientists to be able to offer the truth about the human person without risking professional censure and public pillorying. The church should encourage legislation that upholds the dignity of people's free choices in their relationships, rather than laws that are conditioned by a person's identification with an ideological category. The church should be courageous in presenting her moral teaching as a pathway for all people to achieve happiness and wholeness in themselves and in their relationships, rather than unintentionally supporting a double standard that suggests a difficult moral road for some, while unintentionally implying an easier road for others. The idea that same-sex sexual attraction is an unusual burden rather than a call to chastity with unique parameters. There would be theological implications for this change in terminology also. Anything that can serve to clarify the church's teaching on contentious sexual issues is going to be an important development, especially based on our current crisis of catechesis. In the past decade or so, we are now seeing in church authors, including official documents, far more frequent use of the term persons with same-sex attraction rather than homosexual or person with a homosexual orientation. As I've noted, this newer term places the focus on the person apart from their sexual activity or sexual desire and addresses at least some of the difficulty found in the ambiguity of orientation. Unfortunately, this is still controversial, however, because there are people who argue that suggest that maybe this actually further emphasizes sexual activity. Father James Martin suggests that we identify people in the way they wish to be identified. But this doesn't actually make sense if the identifier is insufficient or wrong. You can see more on this in Martin's work, which I'll also make reference to in just a moment. One of the challenges of the term same-sex attraction is whether it does sufficient justice to the account of the person. Because sexuality is understood as such a significant part of the person, is it fair to speak only of their attractions? According to a sound anthropological vision of the person, the answer is yes. The non-Catholic voices that employ orientation use it in a way that highlights how important not just the sexual dimension of the human person is, but also how important sexual activity is. They combine very tightly your idea of who you are attracted to with sexual activity itself. Human beings, however, are neither more human or dignified, nor less human or dignified, based on whether or not they're engaged in sexual activity. I'm suspecting there is enough people here with vows of chastity who understand that this is the case. We have to stop presuming, as we do too readily in this culture, that there is some sort of tie between sexual experience and happiness. Moving away from this language gives us the opportunity to refocus definitions or understandings of human meaning on more fundamental characteristics, like the ability to understand, the ability to love, not just the ability to seek sexual pleasure. The most important implication of this change of language for the 21st century church are the pastoral ones. On the issue of homosexuality and many other sexual issues, the church's teaching has lost credibility in light of the faster progression of the language of the ongoing sexual revolution. We are always one step behind. We're often 3 steps behind in trying to keep up with the changes in our culture. An example of this can be seen in the debate of the teaching of Jesuit priest James Martin. Father Martin has been hailed as a bridge builder between the church and the homosexual community, a word that he doesn't always define as nicely as he could, but others in the church criticize him for the fact that he fails to clearly articulate the church's teaching. He is also quite skilled at gamesmanship himself, where he never flat out denies the church's teaching, while also never articulating the church's teaching. Among his many critics is Cardinal Robert Sarah, perhaps our next pope, who presented church teaching very well in the Wall Street Journal with no specific reference to the language of orientation. Permit me this slightly longer quote. Cardinal Sarah says, "In her teaching about homosexuality, the church guides her followers by distinguishing their identities from their attractions and actions. First, there are the people themselves, who are always good because they are children of God. Then there are same-sex attractions, which are not sinful if not willed or acted upon, but are nevertheless at odds with human nature. And finally, there are same-sex relations, which are gravely sinful and harmful to the well-being of those who partake in them. People who identify as members of the LGBT community are owed this truth in charity, especially from clergy who speak on behalf of the church about this complex and difficult topic, end quote. Cardinal Sarah makes a beautiful distinction between persons and acts. Now, I want to emphasize that this has always been the case in the church's teaching, but the language of orientation has skewed this perspective and creates an inaccurate and unnecessary bridge between the person and his or her actions. Even the Catechism has had a sort of complication about this language, because we've seen recent changes in the Catechism, controversial changes in the Catechism, in regard to capital punishment, that suggest that this text is subject to revision. As a theologian, I'm not crazy about this, but there it is. It's worth noting that the language of homosexuality has already been modified since the original release of the Catechism in 1991. But for now, the Church is, unfortunately, stuck with the language of the documents of the 1970s through the early 21st century, including the Catechism. But the pastoral needs of the Church, especially in the Western world, demand a better theological anthropology unburdened by a linguistic construct that ultimately acts counter to the building up of the kingdom, and which is vulnerable to splintering into new subcategories as it has time and time again. By the grace of God, we are fearfully, wonderfully made in his image, giving us the godlike freedom to make the choice to live his will for our lives or to reject it. Let's focus on this foundational category of the person rather than a descriptor that confines us to mere bodily desire. Emphasizing this will surely make us more free. Thank you.
Thank you for viewing our program. Please see our website, divinemercymatters.org, for additional educational resources. Thank you.